economic prosperity in 1920s America. And as you can see from the images in front of you, this period was regarded as one that had the highest standard of living in the history of the world, and this was something proudly proclaimed by the government in 1926. So we're going to focus on 4 factors. There are more, and we'll consider those at the end, but we'll sort of focus on 4 specific ones. The first one is the impact of war and how that sped up industrial production. The second factor is industrial and technological development, and we're going to look at those together, but you could look at those separately if you like. The third factor is the role of the government, and the fourth factor is capital and credit. So the first major factor is war, and it presented a golden opportunity for some American businesses to maximize their profits by supplying the Allies with food and munitions. The second thing it also allowed was the Americans to take over markets that were previously supplied by Britain and Germany. But because their industries had been disrupted by war, America became the go-to country for those provisions. So let's just have a look at a couple of tables really quickly, just to show you during the war period the millions of exports that were coming out of America and going into those European countries. And the second thing is to look at the production levels in America as well, just the sheer volume. And if you have a look at some of those, it will just show you the benefits for America and how they had to speed up their production processes to meet the demands. And whilst most countries tend to suffer during war, this diagram and table is really good for showing you that GDP in America went up hugely. It nearly doubled during the war period. So there's lots of really strong evidence here to show how important the war was to American production levels and also American profits. The second major factor to consider was industrial and technological developments. New techniques meant that goods could be produced much more cheaply on a large scale, and this was called mass production. The most famous one of all was the one that Henry Ford pioneered, which was mass production in the car industry. And what he did was he introduced something known as the assembly line. And what this did was it made cars so cheap that thousands of ordinary Americans could afford them. Part of the benefit of this was, again, the introduction of the conveyor belt system. So this idea that, workmen were stationed in one position and did the same job over and over again, and it was passed down to the next person. And what this allowed was incredible speed in terms of production, but also it really helped to cut costs. Now, there were also other huge technological advances during this time. It was a period of great innovation. So plastics like Bakelite were developed effectively for the first time. And here's an example of a Bakelite radio in the 1920s. There were other technological developments such as switchboards, conveyor belts, as you can see from the Ford assembly line, and concrete mixers. Electricity, though, was probably one of the most important technological changes and advances, because it provided a cheaper, more efficient source of power for factories. And ultimately it led to the production of new consumer goods such as refrigerators, vacuum cleaners and radios. And obviously on the back of those successes there were large profits for companies. The next factor to consider is the role of the government, and as you hopefully remember, this period was dominated by the Republican Party, and their main policy was to have minimal government input into people's lives. But obviously what they wanted to also do was create an economic climate in which businesses and the people could prosper. So one of the first things they did was they lowered taxes, and this graph that I'm showing you is a fantastic example of that. The blue line shows the income tax that people are being charged on their wages, and you can see throughout the 1920s it's going down, down, down. But on the flip side, the red line is showing the government profit that they are making from taxes. So you can see by stimulating people investing in business and lowering taxes, it actually enabled the government to make more profit. The second major policy that they introduced to sort of stimulate economic development was they raised tariffs on imported goods. And again, an excellent example is this particular bar chart, which shows in 1920 the millions of dollars that was spent on imported goods, and you can see throughout the 1920s then this lowers, because what's happening is the Americans are producing more of their own goods and they're less inclined to import goods because of the high tariffs on them. So Republican policies really did help stimulate economic growth in the 1920s. So the final factor we're going to consider is capital and credit, and the major way that America benefited from this was during the war they lent money to their allies, the likes of Britain and France, and so in the 1920s that money was now being repaid with interest, and the interest rates were low but the banks were still profiting. And what the American banks now wanted to do in the 1920s was provide that same sort of service to the American people. So Americans were now taking out loans from the banks. They would have to repay them, obviously, at low interest rates, but it now gave them a pool of money with which to purchase things. At the same time, businesses were offering something called hire purchase schemes. Okay, so what that means in effect is if you wanted to buy a car or a consumer product, you don't pay upfront for it. What you do is you pay in installments. And of course, you're not paying the exact price for it. You're going to have to pay with interest on top. So businesses were really benefiting from this. The banks were really benefiting as well, because they were also getting repaid the loans at interest, with interest on top. And what this meant is that credit in this period from the Central Reserve Bank in America increased from, in 1921, $45.3 billion to $73 billion by 1929. And this cheap money, as it's called, what it did was it enabled Americans to sort of develop businesses with ease, and it enabled ordinary everyday Americans to start to buy these consumer products and pay them back in a sort of longer term way. So we've looked at the four major factors. Let's have a little look at just a few others to consider which might feed into your answer. The first one is resources. Now, America is blessed with a wealth of natural resources such as wood, iron, coal, minerals, oil and land. And obviously all of this helped fuel the economic boom in the 1920s, because America became this great industrial power. Another factor to consider is mass marketing. We know about mass-produced goods already, but without a mass market and without them knowing about the goods that are being produced, then there's absolutely no point. So companies spent a huge amount on advertising and developed sophisticated techniques to persuade people to buy. The third factor is mass production. Now, we did mention this earlier with technological and industrial developments, but it's worth mentioning this as a standout idea, because without the likes of Henry Ford pioneering mass production in the car industry, then maybe this would not have developed. And his way of doing things, through using the assembly line, created cheap cars for thousands of Americans, and his ideas were then used throughout all other industries, in particular on new consumer products. The final factor to consider is confidence. Confidence amongst Americans was sky high, and this meant confidence to buy goods, invest in companies, and to try out new ideas. It's a vital ingredient in any economic boom. And it's worth going back to how I started this session, where I mentioned what the American government published in 1926, and they announced that the standard of living in the US in 1926 was the highest it had ever been in the country's history. Americans were officially the richest people in the world.